When Lisa walked into my office, her eyes were shining, not with happiness, but with something between excitement and nervous energy. She sat down on the couch, smoothing her dress, and took a deep breath. "I've always believed in love stories," she began. "The kind you see in movies, where a man just knows exactly what to say, what to do, how to make a woman feel like the center of the universe. Love should be effortless, like magic. I thought, no, I was sure, that one day, I'd meet someone who would prove to me that those stories were real." She smiled, but it was the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to convince themselves of something. Then I met Adam. And for the first time in my life, I thought, I found him. The one. He was so easy to talk to, so funny. He had this way of making me feel like I was the most interesting person in the world. Every text he sent, every little joke, every moment we spent together, it was perfect. I felt like I was living in one of those movies. Like I was the lead actress in my own romance. Lisa's hands gripped the edge of her skirt as she leaned forward. The first time he surprised me with coffee, I thought, this is it. This is how it begins. The sweet little gestures, the thoughtful moments. I imagined how he would bring me flowers just because, how he would plan romantic getaways, how he would always know the perfect thing to say when I was sad. I built this whole future in my head, brick by brick, moment by moment. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. But then, small things started to happen. The kind of things that didn't fit the perfect picture I had in my mind. He forgot my favorite coffee order once, and I laughed it off. Then he forgot my birthday. I told myself he was just bad with dates, that it didn't mean anything. And then, when I was upset about something at work, I waited for him to say the right words, the ones that would make me feel better. But he just didn't. He didn't even notice how much I needed him to say them. Her voice dropped, quieter now, more fragile. I started making excuses. Telling myself he'd learn. That he'd change. That if I just loved him enough, if I was patient, he'd become the man I knew he could be. The one from my dreams. I told myself that love is about seeing someone's potential, right? About believing in them. And I believed in him. I believed in what we could be. Lisa let out a small, hollow laugh, rubbing her forehead. I ignored the fact that he was never that person to begin with. That the man I fell in love with was just a version of him I had created in my head. She looked up at me, searching for something, validation, understanding, maybe even hope. "Isn't that what love is supposed to be?" she whispered. Lisa's story is one I've heard before, in different words, from different people. The fairy tales we grow up with, the love stories we see in movies, they shape our expectations in ways we don't even realize. And when reality doesn't fit the script, we try to force it to. But love isn't about finding someone who plays the perfect role in our imagined story. It's about seeing them for who they truly are, and deciding if that's someone we can love. Lisa sat with her arms crossed, her nails tracing slow, deliberate circles on her forearm. Her expression was distant, like she was staring at something just beyond my office walls, something only she could see. "I ignored so many things in the beginning," she murmured. "I told myself they didn't matter. That all couples had little imperfections, little moments of frustration. But in my mind, I was still holding on to the version of him I wanted to believe in. The version that was just a few steps away from being perfect, if only he tried a little harder." Her eyes flickered with something between frustration and regret. The first time I noticed it was after a long day at work. I came home exhausted, carrying bags of groceries because I wanted to cook something special for us. He was on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I thought, okay, he'll see me struggling and get up to help. But he didn't. He barely looked up. So I dropped the bags a little louder than necessary. Nothing. I started unpacking, and I could feel this pressure building inside me, like I was waiting for a cue in a play. I waited for him to come over, wrap his arms around me, say, "Let me help you, baby." I was so sure it would happen. It had to happen. But all he did was glance over and say, "Did you remember to get more milk?" Lisa gave a small, sharp laugh, shaking her head. I wanted to scream. But instead, I smiled. I told myself he just wasn't paying attention, that it wasn't a big deal. So I cooked dinner. I made everything perfect, just like in my fantasies. Candlelight, music, homemade pasta. And the whole time, I kept waiting for that magical moment where he would suddenly see me the way I wanted to be seen. Where he'd say, "Wow, Lisa, you're incredible." Where he'd finally get it. But do you know what happened? She turned to me, her voice laced with bitter amusement. He ate, said it was good, then got up and went back to his phone. No big declaration. No realization. Just, "That was nice, babe." Like I was some waitress at a diner. And still, I didn't let it break the illusion. I told myself maybe I hadn't done enough yet. Maybe I needed to show him more, love him harder, give him another chance to be the man I knew he could be. Lisa pressed her fingers against her temples, exhaling slowly. It became a pattern. I'd create these perfect moments, waiting for him to step into them the way I imagined he would. And every time he didn't, I felt this sharp sting of disappointment. But instead of seeing the truth, that he just wasn't the person I had built up in my mind, I blamed myself. If only I communicated better. If only I was more patient. If only I could teach him how to love me the way I needed. I wasn't dating Adam. I was dating a fantasy version of him. And the real Adam had no idea he was constantly failing at a test he didn't even know he was taking. She looked down at her hands, her voice quieter now. I guess that's the problem with falling for a dream. You end up ignoring reality until it hurts too much to pretend anymore. Lisa exhaled slowly, as if trying to release the weight pressing against her chest. Her fingers traced invisible patterns on the armrest, and for a moment, she seemed lost in thought. Then, her eyes met mine, filled with something raw and unspoken. "I don't know when it started happening exactly," she said. "Maybe it was gradual, like water dripping onto stone, wearing it down so slowly you don't notice until there's a crack. But at some point, I stopped feeling happy around him. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't some huge fight or a betrayal. It was just this growing, gnawing feeling that something was missing. At first, I thought I was just tired. Work had been stressful. Life had been busy. Maybe I was expecting too much from him. Maybe I was being unfair. So I kept waiting for the feeling to pass. But it didn't. Every time he forgot something important, every time I had to remind him to be thoughtful, every time I saw other couples and wondered why their relationship seemed so much more connected, I felt the crack widen. I told myself love required patience. That he was a good man, and that was what mattered. But then one night, something shifted. I remember it so clearly. We were watching a movie together, some romantic comedy I had chosen. The main character surprised his girlfriend with a trip to her favorite childhood place, a place she had mentioned just once in passing. I turned to Adam and asked, "If you could take me anywhere in the world as a surprise, where would it be?" He barely glanced at me. "I don't know." "Paris?" "Paris." A generic answer. A safe one. A guess. So I pushed. "Okay, but if you really thought about it, if you wanted to take me somewhere that means something to me, where would it be?" He looked confused. "I don't know. You like beaches, right?" I felt something in my chest tighten. I had told him, more than once, about the small cabin in the mountains where my grandparents used to take me as a kid. About the way the air smelled up there, crisp and untouched. About how it was the one place I felt completely at peace. But he didn't remember. Or he never really listened in the first place. Lisa's voice wavered, her grip tightening on the fabric of her dress. And that was the moment I realized, I wasn't asking for too much. I wasn't crazy for wanting to feel seen, to feel understood. Love isn't just about being with someone who's nice to you. It's about being with someone who knows you. Who hears you even when you're not speaking. And Adam, he didn't. He liked me. He enjoyed my company. But he didn't see me. And I had spent so much time trying to make him fit into the fantasy in my head that I hadn't stopped to ask if I was really happy. The answer was right in front of me. I just didn't want to see it. Lisa's story is something so many people go through without realizing it. We tell ourselves love is about effort, about compromise, about waiting for things to get better. But sometimes, the real question is, are we forcing something that was never really there? Lisa let out a slow breath, as if exhaling the last remnants of denial. Her fingers twisted the ring on her hand, turning it over and over, though it wasn't an engagement ring, just a simple band she always wore. I don't know when I officially gave up on the fantasy, she said. Maybe it wasn't a single moment. Maybe it was a collection of them, piling up until I couldn't ignore them anymore. Her gaze dropped to the floor, unfocused, lost in memory. There was a night. I remember it so clearly. We had argued earlier that day, over something small, something stupid. I had asked him to plan a date night, to just take the initiative for once. And he had nodded, said, "Sure, babe," like he always did. But when the day came, he had nothing planned. Not even a simple dinner reservation. Nothing. So I got upset. I told him I was tired of always being the one who cared more, who put in the effort. He got defensive, told me I was overreacting and that not everyone is obsessed with grand romantic gestures. And I remember standing there, staring at him, thinking. I'm not asking for grand gestures. I'm asking for proof that I matter. Lisa swallowed hard, pressing her lips together before continuing. I left the house to clear my head. I walked for a long time, just wandering, just thinking. And then I passed by this little cafe near the park, and I saw this older couple sitting by the window. They weren't talking much, just sipping their coffee, occasionally sharing a look, a small smile. But there was this ease between them. This comfort. And I thought, that's what I want. I don't need dramatic speeches or over-the-top romance. I just want someone who chooses me. Every day. In the small ways, in the quiet moments. Her voice softened. When I went home that night, Adam barely looked up from his phone. Feel better? He asked. And I just stood there, staring at him, realizing that he didn't even wonder where I had gone. He didn't ask what was wrong. And that was when it hit me. He wasn't a bad person. He wasn't cruel or mean. He just wasn't my person. And no matter how much I twisted myself into knots, no matter how many expectations I buried just to make things work, I was never going to be truly happy with him. But admitting that? Walking away from someone who hadn't done anything wrong, but still wasn't right. That was the hardest part. Lisa's story is one I hear so often. So many people hold on, not because they're happy, but because they're afraid to let go. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of starting over. But sometimes, the scariest choice is also the right one. Lisa sat still for a moment, her hands resting in her lap, her breathing even. But there was something different in her expression now, lighter, calmer. As if speaking her truth had loosened the tight grip of disappointment she had been carrying for so long. I thought leaving him would feel like a breakup from the movies, she said. Tears, screaming, maybe even dramatic music playing in the background. But it wasn't like that at all. It was quiet. Almost peaceful. Her fingers traced the edge of her sleeve, absent-mindedly. I told him I needed to talk, and for the first time in a long time, he actually put his phone down and gave me his full attention. Maybe he could sense it. Maybe he already knew. I told him I cared about him, that he was a good person, but I wasn't happy. That I had been waiting for him to be someone he wasn't, and that wasn't fair, to either of us. He didn't argue. Didn't get angry. He just stared at me for a long time before saying, "So that's it?" Lisa let out a breath, shaking her head. That was the hardest part. Knowing that to him, this was coming out of nowhere. He hadn't noticed how unhappy I was. He hadn't realized how many times I had begged for something more, even in the quietest ways. I think part of me wanted him to fight for it. To suddenly wake up, to say, "No, don't go, I'll do better." But he didn't. He just nodded, looked away, and said, "I guess I always knew I wasn't what you wanted." She looked up at me then, her eyes softer than before. And maybe that was the truth. Maybe he always knew, deep down, that I was expecting something from him that he wasn't capable of giving. But instead of admitting it, we both just kept pretending. So I packed my things. I left. And you know what? It hurt. It really did. But it also felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater for too long. Lisa leaned back against the couch, a small, almost shy smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It wasn't an instant transformation. I didn't wake up the next morning feeling free and healed and whole. At first, I felt lost. Like I had been running toward this idea of love for so long that I didn't know who I was without it. But over time, I started seeing things differently. I stopped blaming him. I stopped blaming myself. And I started realizing that real love isn't about sculpting someone into the perfect partner. It's about finding someone who already fits, not perfectly, not flawlessly, but in a way that feels right. In a way that doesn't require constant molding and reshaping and hoping. She paused for a moment, then smiled. And the funny thing is, when I let go of the idea of perfect love, I started seeing real love all around me. In the way my best friend always remembers how I take my coffee. In the way my parents laugh together at the same old jokes. In the way I finally started treating myself, not as someone waiting for love, but as someone who deserved it, from myself first. Lisa's story is one that so many people can relate to. The journey of letting go, not just of a person, but of an illusion, of an expectation that was never going to be fulfilled. Have you ever had to walk away from something that wasn't necessarily bad, but just wasn't right for you? I'd love to hear your thoughts.